In this lecture, we are going to start with bioenergetics, and we might break this up into a couple, but we're going to start with the basics of bioenergetics and start moving into how that affects our body and energy and how we're able to move. To get started, we do want to make sure that you know metabolism. You hear this word a lot, but a lot of people don't know what it is. And metabolism is simply a sum of all the chemical reactions that occur in the body. And there's two typical categories. So there's anabolic reactions, which make molecules synthesize molecules, and catabolic reactions, which break molecules down. And so typically, when you hear the word metabolism, you think of how much energy you burn in the day. Someone with a fast metabolism, and it takes energy to either make molecules or break them down. And so our body is constantly doing both. And so the energy it takes for us to do those things, we term as metabolism. And so bioenergetics is the process of converting foodstuffs into usable energy for cell work. And so they're very related in that, but you typically hear this word metabolism. But a lot of times when you hear this word metabolism, people are more referring to bioenergetics. Um, and so with that, we do want to make sure that you remember some cell structure. So we'll go through this pretty quick. So cell membrane, so that outer covering of every cell, permeable to certain things, and protects it from the extracellular environment. You have the nucleus in the center, which contains the genes and regulatory proteins for synthesis and mitosis and all of those things. Inside the cell, you have a lot of cytoplasm, which is kind of a fluid portion where things can move in and out of and move through. And this contains all of your organelles like mitochondria. And mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. It's where energy is kind of made, and we'll talk about that this semester. When we talk about muscle cells, so skeletal muscle cells in particular, there are two different populations or locations for mitochondria to be located. And so this is a muscle cell on the screen, and you can see on the outside edges of the cell, we have these mitochondria, which are these little pink circles, or sorry, the yellow tubes right here. So they're on the outside edges of the cell, but you also have some that are inside deeper in the cell to allow energy to be made for different organelles, but also for what's called your thick and thin filaments, for those to be active throughout there. So every muscle fiber can have its kind of own energy supply throughout the muscle, so you're not having to rely on just one source of it. It's throughout that muscle. And so when you're looking at this, there's lots of studies where people are looking at genes and the microbiology and protein synthesis that has to do with exercise physiology. And so it's all really connected in the science realm of this. And so what we kind of look at with this exercise physiology is, well, how do these changes and how does this biochemistry affect us kind of at the macro level when it comes to muscular strength and that protein synthesis and contractile protein? So what's going on these small levels that we then can extrapolate into these larger levels so that we can make things better, so we can make someone faster or stronger. And so it's really understanding what's going on at the cellular level allows us to then make more advanced determinations of what's going to occur with your whole body, depending on what kind of training or exercise or not exercise that is occurring. And so in exercise physiology, there's a big linkage between biochemistry, molecular biology, genetics, and they're all really tied in. And so as you dig deeper into this, even if it's not where you want to be, you're going to learn some pieces of this. And some people are biochemists that then come into the exercise physiology world because it interests them. So just realizing that all these things are connected and make a difference is a big thing. So when it comes to those cellular chemical reactions in the body, you have endogenic reactions, which require energy to be added to the reactants to make them happen. You have exogenic, which is where we release energy. So depending on, think kind of synthesis, we have to add energy to make things occur. And then with that release of energy, that would be releasing energy so that we can move, so that we can cause movement, or we can cause energy to something else, like pushing a box, we have to release energy. And then you've got coupled, where it kind of has both going on, which is a lot of our reactions in the body. And so we'll talk about the breakdown of glucose this semester. And glucose is simply sugar. We use that to help make energy. And we convert glucose into CO2, so what we breathe out, and water. And as we're converting sugar into carbon dioxide and water, it releases energy that we can utilize some of it, and a lot of it just creates heat that we will also get rid of through different aspects of our body, sweating being one of them. And so this is kind of what occurs. We break that down to release energy that we can then use for other things, which is helpful for us to do a variety of different tasks. And so these are typically coupled reactions, whereas one thing's going on, it's leading to products of another, and that is then feeding back into the system. And you'll kind of see how some parts of what is released in one cycle is going to go into another cycle to help that, and then vice versa. And so that's a really cool thing about the body's not wanting to waste anything. It's always trying to use everything that comes off of a reaction for something else. So in this, it's good to know a couple terms. Just remembering, if you hear the word oxidation, that's removing electrons from something. So think of that chemistry level. Reduction is adding electrons to that, so kind of changing those charges, positive, negative charges. And so it's good to be familiar with those. Also, just to get familiar with, we're going to be using these terms NAD and FAD. And so you can see the names there. And part of what will happen is, what you'll see is we'll convert NAD and FAD into FADH and NADH, which is where they had hydrogens added, which is adding electrons, so reduced them. And so both of these are going to help with that bioenergetic process of making energy, so that we can complete and do activities and other processes in the body. And so NAD and FAD are just electron carriers to help them carry those hydrogen electrons over, and that's what they're utilized for. But a big important concept also with this is something called enzymes. And enzymes are in the body, and they're really to help reactions to occur. So reactions occur on their own. You don't need enzymes for reactions to occur, but enzymes simply make it easier for reactions to occur. So this example shows you how you have the reactant, the green thing, and then you have this pink wall that kind of blocks it from going down the hill and doing its work. And so there's this activation energy, there's amount of energy needed to get the ball rolling down a hill, basically, especially when a wall's in the way. Well, enzymes basically help make the reactants a little bit more robust, make them bigger, but also the wall a little bit smaller, so it takes less energy to get those starting to move down the hill, is the best way to think about that. And you can see that in this image here. So enzymes are really helpful. It helps speed up the process and make it easier for them to occur. Some of the reactions that we'll talk about that happen in the body this semester would occur on their own without enzymes being present, but it may take days, weeks for them to occur, where they can occur in the matter of milliseconds or seconds when we have enzymes present. And so they really help to make things actually possible to occur. And so you can kind of, another figure just kind of giving you an example of how those enzymes kind of help activate and move things along. And so one other thing that will be used as you see looking through these processes, things to remind you of or things to get familiar with if you're not too much familiar with them, is just thinking about what's going on if you hear things like kinases or dehydrogenases when it comes to enzymes. And so it gives you an idea of what's going to happen. So anytime you see the word kinase, so it may be something like phosphate kinase would be an example that you might see later. Well, that's going to add a phosphate group. And so it's in the name, and that phosphate tells us it's an actual just piece of phosphate. But anytime you see the word kinase, we're going to add a phosphate group somewhere. Anytime you see the word dehydrogenase, so lactate dehydrogenase, it means you're simply removing a hydrogen atom. So if it's lactate dehydrogenase, you're removing a hydrogen atom from lactate, chemical structure of lactate. So other things to look at is things like oxidase. So oxidases mean you're involving oxygen in that process. Isomerases just simply mean that you're rearranging the structure. So if you see something being called an isomerase, that enzyme is simply taking the structure and rearranging it, putting it in a different order. So maybe for an example, maybe something is alphabetized, but you want it to be an example would be when you're shopping, instead of having everything in alphabetical order, maybe you want it in price order from highest to lowest. And so that would be in a rearrangement. And so isomerases do that to our chemical structures. They just simply rearrange the chemical in a different way so that the next step can occur. And so enzymes are important. They help reactions to occur quicker and make them more useful. But it's also good to look at enzymes at a medical level because it can be an indication of some kind of disease or tissue damage. So one example is you have creatine kinase. So again, think about kinase, what that means. Creatine, maybe you've heard of that before, but if you see creatine kinase, an enzyme in the blood, that's an indication that someone may be having a heart attack or a myocardial infarction. And so you can see how these can be helpful in the medical world. And here's a list of some enzymes that people may see, and if they see them in the blood, what this might mean. And so you can kind of maybe connect those, give you some idea. Sometimes connecting pathologies or diseases to certain enzymes may help you to remember them a little bit easier. When it comes to these enzymes and their activity, there are lots of things that affect them, from temperature. So when your body gets warm, it may make enzymes more active, which helps process to happen quicker and more abundantly. But if it gets too hot, that can actually decrease the activity. pH is the same, so that acidity or base of the blood, the blood being a base, changes in pH can increase or decrease enzyme activity, and it's going to be dependent on what the enzyme actually is. And again, if you get too acidic or too basic, usually that's going to decrease all enzymes. There's a very fine range that these actually typically work. It's also going to vary on where they're located. So think about in your stomach, you have stomach acid. So the enzymes in there will work at a much lower pH than something in your blood, which is a little bit more basic or neutral. And here are some charts that just kind of show you your normal body temperature and body temperature during exercise and enzyme activity. And you can see how there's this kind of increase as your body temperature increases and a little bit more. So like when you get sick, they may increase a little bit more, but at a certain point, they decrease very quickly. And if they get cool, they decrease very quickly. And so your body's always trying to maintain this steady state somewhere in that range to give you optimal efficiency. And this is the same pH scale as well that you can see. So where we're going to head with this is we're going to start talking about, well, how does our body kind of make energy? How is it using these enzymes and these bioenergetics to help us make energy so that we can do things or synthesize? And so we're going to talk about the use of things like glucose, which is blood sugar or sugar in the blood, glycogen, which is a storage form of glucose in the liver and muscles, and the fact that we have something called glycogenolysis, which is where we can take and break down glycogen into glucose to utilize it. And so we'll look at some of those. So we're talking about these different fuels and how they're going to be utilized and what those processes look like, because each process has its advantages and its disadvantages. Other fuels would be things like fatty acids and triglycerides, so fat that's stored in the skeletal muscles or in adipose tissue, and how that's broken down. You also have steroids and how those are needed. So we're going to be looking at a lot of these and how they are helping with this fuel in the body. So amino acids, which come from protein, and the fact that amino acids are great for synthesizing and building new protein structures in our body. They're not our favorite way to use energy for exercise. It can be done if needed. And there's something called gluconeogenesis that goes through that process of making our amino acids into something like glucose that we can utilize. It doesn't happen a ton, but it is something we'll touch on as well. And so that's where we're going to stop this one, and we'll shoot another video that starts talking about something called ATP and start continuing through this bioenergetics process.